Hi, and welcome back to my series exploring the structure of behavior by Maurice Merleau-Ponty. This is part 3 of my series, and we're going to be finishing up part 2 of the book. So this is where we're at. We're in the latter half of part 2 of the book, which is titled Higher Forms of Behavior. So just as always, I'll just put here at first the main kind of framework of the book, what it's exploring. He says, our goal is to understand the relations of consciousness and nature. By nature, we understand a multiplicity of events external to each other and bound together by relations of causality. All right, so in this part of the book, part 2, this chapter is titled The Structures of Behavior. So he says, what we have just said concerning their physiological substrate only anticipates the direct examination of higher forms of behavior. And our reason for not beginning with such an examination was to show that the method which is called physiological refers us back to behavior. The image which Pavlov gives of behavior and the results of recent investigations must now be compared. So he's still going to be exploring a lot about Pavlov in this chapter. And this is on the conditioned reflex. Much of this is about the conditioned reflex that reflects this idea from Pavlov. Since the theory of the conditioned reflex has attempted above all to explain the expansion of the reflexogenic field of the animal, the decisive point for it should be to explain the acquisition of a new and adapted mode of behavior. As a theory of learning, it joined forces with the principle of trial and error. Presented with a new situation, the animal would react by a series of attempts to which no intentional character, that is, no internal relation to the situation, should be attributed. Speaking further on the conditioned reflex, he says, behaviorism is content to say that the white curtain becomes the conditioned stimulus of the positive reactions, thereby confusing under the same name reactions to the goal, which could indeed be evoked by it after training, and reactions preparatory to the solution, which it could not establish. In reality, the difficulty is one of principle. The conditioned reflex theory presents stimulations and responses which succeed each other in an organism like a series of events, external to each other and between which no relations can be established other than those of immediate temporal contiguity. But if learning is really only a particular case of physical causality, so here he's talking about learning, kind of like with this idea of conditioning, so he's bringing up learning. If learning is really only a particular case of physical causality, it is difficult to see how the order of temporal passage would reverse itself, how the effect could become the cause of its cause. For the perception of the lever or the goal to bring back the useful manipulations, it is not sufficient for them to have preceded it in objective time. The attitudes which will lead to the goal or their physiological substrate must possess, either before the animal has tried them or after they have succeeded, some distinctive property which designates them for success and integrates them into the perception of the goal. Thus, to learn never consists in being made capable of repeating the same gesture, but of providing an adapted response to the situation by different means. So you can have different means of achieving a kind of goal. Nor is the response acquired with regard to an individual situation. It is rather a question of a new aptitude for resolving a series of problems of the same form, of the same kind. It's not hyper-specific to one situation. And so he says it is precisely the behaviorist school which has brought to light the abstract character of certain animal reactions. So he says by tracing this behaviorist line of thinking and seeing what it highlights needs to be acknowledged, he says this brings to light that even within animal reactions, there is some abstraction in it. So he next distinguishes universal from abstract. He says universal attempts the same solution in essentially different situations when they have a single common trait, whereas the more abstract looks like the flexibility of habits which are equally efficacious in the face of materially different situations, provided that they have the same meaning. So the organism picks up on the fact that there is a meaning to the situation, and they have a certain kind of flexibility to apply different strategies, different ways of attempting to meet their needs in that situation. The true stimulus is not the one defined by physics and chemistry. The reaction is not this or that particular series of movements, and the connection between the two is not the simple coincidence of two successive events. There must be a principle in the organism which ensures that the learning experience will have a general relevance. A few pages later, he talks about what some people want to reject as not within the realm of science, what's not the object of science. He says, if one refuses to take into consideration as the object of science every property of phenomena which is not manifested in the intuition of a particular case, and which appears only to reflective consciousness by an analysis of the varied concordances or by a reading of the statistics, it is not anthropomorphism which is excluded, it is science. It is not objectivity which is defended, it is realism and nominalism. Scientific laws which are not given in the facts, but which one finds expressed in them, would be subject to the same grievance. When one speaks of structure of the situation and its meaning, these words evidently designate certain givens of human experience and are consequently suspect of anthropomorphism. But, he says, colors, lights, and pressures, or their expression in physical language, are no less so. It is clear that all the terms of which we can make use refer to phenomena of human experience, naive or scientific. The whole question is to know whether they are truly constitutive of the objects intended in an intersubjective experience and necessary for their definition. So, he's basically saying that those who are so worried about anthropomorphism creeping into what is considered scientific, what's considered a scientific approach, these people who want to focus so much on like physiology, behaviorists and such, they want so much to stay away from what comes from like the mind perceiving reality, perception. That's kind of what that anthropomorphism refers to. He says we really can't avoid it, and that's too narrow of a qualification. Yeah, these terms like colors, lights, pressures, we have to make use of terms that refer to human experience. We can do that and still be describing something well. It's intersubjective experience, he says. And it's more important to consider, is something necessary for a definition or is it not? That we can't entirely avoid bringing human experience into it. Okay, so for the rest of this video, we're going to be talking about these sections. The following parts of this part of the book, part 2, explore 3 different kinds of forms, and then it's followed by just a few pages long, the conclusion. The bulk of this is the 15 or so pages that he spends on Amovable Forms. The rest of these sections are fairly brief, just like the first kind of forms are just like a page long. So it's the Amovable Forms that takes up the bulk of this. First, the Syncretic Forms. So this is a level of behavior which can be summarized as instinctive. He says at this level, behavior is tied either to certain abstract aspects of the situations or to certain complexes of very special stimuli. In any case, it is imprisoned in the framework of its natural conditions and treats unexpected situations only as allusions to the vital situations which are prescribed for it. This complex of conditions corresponds to natural situations which release the instinctive acts of the animal. The training which can be achieved with the starfish scarcely goes beyond the framework of the situations in which the animal finds itself in its natural life. It is never to the experimental stimulus that the frog reacts. The stimulus is reflexogenic only to the extent that it resembles one of the dimensionally limited objects of a natural activity. And the reactions which the stimulus evokes are determined not by the physical particularities of the present situation, but by the biological laws of behavior. If one wishes to give a precise meaning to words, behavior of this kind, which responds literally to a complex of stimuli rather than to certain essential traits of the situation, should be called instinctive. So basically you can sum this form up by just describing it as instinctive. It is just really more basic and driven by these natural instincts. The kinds of behavior which are ordinarily called instinctive imply structures which are much less adherent than those we just described. Thus, it is often difficult to distinguish them from intelligent behavior. So the previous form, he only spends like a page and a half on it. He spends a lot of time talking about this next kind of form, which is Amovable Forms. So this is all about signals. And then the third form is symbolic. So just to give you a little bit of a nutshell of what we're going to be talking about here. So he says, as soon as we observe in the history of behavior the appearance of signals which are not determined by the instinctual equipment of the species, we can presume that they are founded on structures which are relatively independent of the materials in which they are realized. So he's going to say this a couple of times later in the next few pages, but he says that signal operates as a meaningful gestalt. So it's not tied simply to its matter, but there is meaning involved, whereas that's different than instinct. With signal, you have a creature that is able of kind of interpreting meaning in some way. It's not as literal. Says signal learning is not a simple transfer of this de facto contiguity into behavior. It must become a contiguity for the organism. He says the signal is a configuration sign gestalt. It's basically just a configuration is one way of describing a gestalt. Just to kind of recap what that word means, it means a lot. It's been used in a lot of different ways. But it's this idea of a whole that is different from or more than the sum of its parts. There is a relation or a meaning that there's a pattern, there's some kind of sign that's not just about its literal parts, about its material, but it's about the meaning, the orderliness, the relations, the system of the thing. It's not just what it's made out of. He says, but the power of adapting to the structure of signals rather than to their material properties is not without limit in animals. So he says this is a step up from the first kind of forms, but this does have a limit. And the third kind of form, symbolic, will be a higher kind of form. So he's exploring what behavior can tell us. He says that by looking at a relatively objective description of behavior, it shows us structure. So he says, thus the objective description of behavior uncovers in it a more or less articulated structure. in more or less rich interior signification in reference to situations, which are sometimes individual, sometimes abstract, and sometimes essential. The same variety would be noticed if we were to consider modes of behavior in themselves more difficult and more integrated than elementary signal behavior, in which the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, instead of being simply contiguous, present a relation which we would call logical or objective. From then on, the conditioned stimulus gives rise to special reactions, which are more and more clearly distinguished from reactions to the goal. In human language, one can say that it becomes the means to a certain end. All right, so now we come to the last of the three kinds of forms, symbolic forms. And so this is basically what humans are capable of. He says, in animal behavior, signs always remain signals and never become symbols. A subject who, so he's talking again about learning, and what is the deepest kind of learning? He says, a subject who knows how to type or to play the organ is capable of improvising. So it's not just a kind of habit, but you actually kind of have this mastery, this ability to improvise, he says, is an important characteristic of like true, deeper learning. He says, the organist does not inspect the organ part by part. In the space where his hands and feet will play, he recognizes sectors, direction markings, and curves of movement which correspond not to ensembles of definite notes, but to expressive values. So the word values there, meaning humans are capable of understanding meaning in a deeper level that he would call symbolic, and it's expressive. He says, the character of the melody, the graphic configuration of the musical text, and the unfolding of the gestures participate in a single structure, have in common a single nucleus of signification. The relation of the expression to the expressed, which is one of simple juxtaposition in the parts, is internal and necessary in the wholes. So here he's talking about genuine learning. He says genuine aptitudes demand that the stimulus become efficacious by its internal properties of structure, by its immanent signification, and they demand that the response symbolize along with the stimulus. It is this possibility of varied expressions of the same theme, this multiplicity of perspective, which is lacking in animal behavior. It is this which introduces a cognitive conduct and a free conduct. In making possible all substitutions of points of view, it liberates the stimuli from the here and now relations in which my own point of view involves them. So this is an important point. He says what characterizes symbolic forms, what characterizes the human experience, the human kind of structure, is noticing that we have this behavior where we are able to hold multiplicity of perspectives. We're able to kind of rise above in that way the immediacy of the here and now situation to kind of be thinking about what is the meaning that is not just restricted to my immediate conditions, but to hold a wider view, to kind of switch in and out concepts in a more abstract way. He says this is what introduces a cognitive conduct and freedom, more of a capacity for freedom in humans. He says next, with symbolic forms, a conduct appears which expresses the stimulus for itself, which is open to truth and to the proper value of things, which tends to the adequation of the signifying and signified, of the intention and that which it intends. Here behavior no longer has only one signification, it is itself signification. So here he makes a critique of Pavlov. He says the preceding descriptions permit us to situate the conditioned reflex of Pavlov's theory in its true place. So he's talking about a dog in an experiment getting restless, wanting to get loose after a certain period of time. He says Pavlov interprets this conduct as a freedom reflex, but the word reflex has no meaning if it does not designate a specific reaction to certain determined excitants. The reaction in question, however, is an indeterminate refusal to respond to stimuli. This restlessness, this want for freedom, that doesn't seem to align with how Pavlov describes it as reflex. The general inhibition which is presented to us is not constructed according to the mechanical laws of conditioning. It expresses a law of a new kind, the orientation of the organism toward modes of behavior which have a biological meaning, toward natural situations, that is, a priori of the organism. Thus, there is a norm inscribed in the facts themselves. Next, Merleau-Ponty contrasts empiricism of Pavlov with intellectualism. And he says Pavlov was sneaking in postulates from intellectualism. He says, at the same time that he was maintaining a psychological empiricism, Pavlov was borrowing his postulates from intellectualism. Empiricism and intellectualism carry over into primitive modes of behavior, structures which belong to a very high level. Structure of pure juxtaposition, which is the atom, or structure of pure interiority, the relation. He then says, it will be maintained, perhaps, that in refusing to construct behavior on the basis of these notions, which are constitutive of what we understand by nature, in rejecting them as anthropomorphic, we are implicitly referring to some reality in itself, to some grund from which intelligence emerges. So this kind of dichotomy of thing in itself versus intelligence, and with relation to which it can be called superficial. But this same reality, it will be added, can neither be named nor conceptualized except by the intellect. We will thus have to distinguish that from intellectualism. So that's something that he's going to want to do next in this book, is to make this distinction, to retain an idea of intellect without opting for what he calls intellectualism. So it seems kind of like this contrast of thing and idea, or intellect, this dichotomy, empiricism versus intellectualism. He says, and so now we're in the conclusion of this part of the book. He says, traditionally lower or mechanical reactions, which, like physical events, are functions of antecedent conditions and thus unfold in objective time and space, are distinguished from higher reactions, which do not depend on stimuli taken materially, but rather on the meaning of the situation. So not the matter, but the meaning, the signal, the symbol of the situation, in which appear, therefore, to presuppose a view of the situation. So he says we can't talk about how we respond not just to the matter, to these like physical level of stimuli, but how beings interpret signals and symbols in their situations. We have to presuppose a view, a perspective that an organism is taking. He says, which appear therefore to presuppose a view of the situation, a prospection, and to belong no longer to the order of the in itself, but to the order of the for itself. But he says behavior, inasmuch as it has a structure, is not situated in either of these two orders, of the in itself and for itself. He says it does not unfold in objective time and space, like a series of physical events. Each moment does not occupy one and only one point of time. And this is a cool quote here. He says, at the decisive moment of learning, so notice that he's talking about learning, a now stands out from the series of nows. acquires a particular value and summarizes the groupings which have preceded it, as it engages and anticipates the future of the behavior. This now transforms the singular situation of the experience into a typical situation and the effective reaction into an aptitude. So it branches the past and the future. From this moment on, behavior is detached from the order of the in itself and becomes a projection outside the organism of a possibility. Notice that word possibility, which is internal to it. The world, inasmuch as it harbors living beings, ceases to be a material plenum consisting of juxtaposed parts. It opens up at the place where behavior appears. The gestures of behavior, the intentions which it traces in the space around the animal, are not directed to the true world or pure being. So that's kind of this idea of thing and pure being or pure idea. Realists versus idealists. But to being for the animal, that is, to a certain milieu characteristic of the species. They do not allow the showing through of a consciousness, that is, this pure idea, pure being, that is, a being whose whole essence is to know, but rather a certain manner of treating the world, of being in the world, or of existing. So that's a very important quote, noticing that term, being in the world. Next he says, it is only at the level of symbolic conduct. So here he's talking about the level, the structure of behavior where there is symbol, that third form. It is only at the level of symbolic conduct, and more exactly at the level of exchanged speech, that foreign existences, at the same time as our own, moreover, appear to us as ordered to the true world. It is only at this level that instead of seeking to insinuate his stubborn norms, the subject of behavior derealizes himself and becomes a genuine alter ego. And yet the constitution of the other person, as another I, is never completed, since his utterance, even having become a pure phenomenon of expression, always and indivisibly remains expressive as much of himself as of the truth. So here is a very important quote that summarizes his thesis of the book. The structure of behavior, as it presents itself to perceptual experience, is neither thing nor consciousness. So remember that overarching question of the book. How do we kind of relate the idea of pure thing with pure idea? Idealism versus realism, realistic analysis. And it is this which renders it opaque to the mind. He says, the object of the preceding chapter was not only to establish that behavior is reducible to its alleged parts. That's only part of what he's been discussing. He's also been building this idea that, he says, the essential feature of the phenomenon, the paradox which is constitutive of it. Behavior is not a thing, but neither is it an idea. It is not the envelope of a pure consciousness, and as the witness of behavior, I am not a pure consciousness. It is precisely this which we wanted to say in stating that behavior is a form. So this notion of form is very important, and here he's going to say we still need to get more into what this notion of form means. There's an ambiguity. He says, and I'll read the quote here, but he says, it has helped us to create a bridge between this dichotomized pitting of idea and thing against each other. Form helps us find a way to proceed without getting lost in one of those extremes. But there's still ambiguity to what it means, so he says that's what we're going to be exploring next in the book, later in the book. So I'll read the quote. Thus, with this notion of form, we have found the means of avoiding the classical antitheses of the analysis of the central sector of behavior, as well as in that of its visible manifestations. More generally, this notion saves us from the alternative of a philosophy which juxtaposes externally associated terms. So again, that's kind of this like causality of things which are external to each other. And of another philosophy which discovers relations. Remember that word relations from a few slides ago, which are intrinsic to thought in all phenomena. So I think that's more of the idea of like pure consciousness, pure idea, pure being. But precisely for this reason, the notion of form is still ambiguous. Up until now, it has been introduced by physical examples and defined by characteristics which made it appropriate for resolving problems of psychology and physiology. It helps us bridge these things which have been dichotomized. He says, now this notion of form must be understood in itself, without which the philosophical significance of what precedes would remain equivocal. So that's how he ends part 2 of the book, and I look forward to starting part 3 next time. Thanks.